welcome back to another episode of Law Made Simple, where we break down some of the most important legal cases and issues in Malawi in a way that's very easy to understand. I'm Pempumale, your host, and today we're diving into the Kathumba case, which I am going to put the full citation in the description because it did involve a couple of people. We had a few individuals joined in with some civil society groups against the president, against Ministry of Health. We had the MDF involved in there and a few others. So this case did bring about some legal challenges that questioned the constitutionality of the lockdown measures that were placed during the COVID-19 pandemic. It also raised a few questions about the balance between protecting public health and preserving constitutional rights, and it also touched on how executive powers interact with law during emergencies. So stay tuned as we dive into it and look at the issues and the facts. So let's start by going back to the pandemic days, which was in March 2020. I think that's when these lockdown rules were set forth. Like many other countries around the world, Malawi was facing the growing threat of COVID-19. And in response, our President Peter Mutharika by then declared a state of national disaster. Now, this wasn't a state of emergency. It was a state of national disaster. I'm going to divert a bit from the case and just try to distinguish between the two. A state of national disaster is considered a low-key response because then the government is given power just to move around and mingle with the rights and to make necessary changes where necessary. But a state of emergency is more temporary because it gives the government power to completely shut down and completely suspend some rights. So we were in a state of national disaster, and the national disaster still gives the Ministry of Health the authority to introduce new rules under the Public Health Act, which is really an old law, honestly. So these rules that followed included a national lockdown. And as we saw globally, lockdowns were meant to limit the spread of the virus, but they also brought about some significant restrictions on daily life. Things like the right to move freely, the ability to work, the ability to gather. For many Malawians, these measures were quite challenging, especially when you consider how many people rely on day-to-day income just to get by. That's where the legal challenge came in. We had several groups and individuals, including Esther Kathumba in this case, step forward and challenge the lockdown rules in the court. So their main argument was that these restrictions were infringing on some of their fundamental rights. We're talking about rights that are protected under the Constitution, like the freedom of movement, the right to economic activity, the freedom of assembly. But the case wasn't just about the impact of these rules. The claimants also raised some legal questions, and one of the key points was that the government had not declared a state of emergency, which was argued to be very necessary for these kinds of restrictions. The Constitution does give the government the right to suspend some rights during emergencies. But we were in a state of disaster. So since the government had not declared had declared only a state of disaster, the claimants felt that the government did not follow the procedure. They also pointed out that these rules had not been subjected to parliament scrutiny, which is also a requirement under the Constitution. Essentially, they argue that the executive had overstepped its authority by introducing these lockdown measures without bringing them before the parliament. So the case went to court, even though the lockdown rules were revoked before the hearing of this case. But the court decided to proceed with this case for the reason that there was a possibility that similar rules could be reintroduced in the future, considering the pandemic was not yet over. So it was important to just resolve the legal issues there and then. The court's ruling delivered some few key points. Firstly, the court found that the lockdown rules were not just a limitation of rights, but a derogation. And the distinction is very important because the limitation is when the government puts some reasonable restrictions on rights for things like public safety, but a derogation is more serious. It means the government is actually suspending your rights. The court said that suspending these fundamental rights, like the freedom of movement or the right to work, couldn't be done without declaring a state of emergency. Another key point from the court was about these rights that cannot be derogated, rights that cannot be suspended during an emergency. Things like the right of conscience and freedom of religion fall into this category. That's why we even have like a prophet as the claimant as well in this case. The court made it clear that these rights must always be protected regardless of the circumstances. And there's the issue of the parliamentary oversight. The court emphasized that the Constitution requires certain laws that affect fundamental rights to be passed through Parliament first. This wasn't done in this case, and the court found that that was a problem. Essentially, the executive branch, meaning the president and his ministers, cannot bypass Parliament when it comes to making such important decisions. Now, the Kathumba case didn't just address the legality of lockdown rules. It also highlighted some broader areas about governance and the rule of law. One of the big questions that came up was about the balance of power between different branches of government. The court's ruling highlighted the principle of separation of powers, which is a very broad topic, and I'm not going to go deep into it. But the idea is that the executive and the legislature and the judiciary each have their own roles, and one branch shouldn't interfere with the others. In this case, the court reminded everyone that even in times of crisis, the executive branch cannot act unilaterally when it comes to decisions that impact people's constitutional rights. The parliament still needs to play its role, and because the parliament's role is to make law, and the courts are there to ensure that law is followed. But beyond the legal arguments, there was a real-world impact to consider as well. In Malawi, many people, the majority of the population lives in poverty, or rather depends on informal work. And a strict lockdown, especially without any financial support or any safety nets, can have some devastating effects. The court seemed to acknowledge this reality by noting that a lockdown would disproportionately impact the poorest members of the society, because you're telling them not to go out and look for money and food to feed their families. In fact, the court's ruling pointed out that the government needed to think carefully about how such measures could affect daily lives of an ordinary Malawian. It was also a reminder that while public health is crucial, so is ensuring the people can meet their basic needs during a time of crisis. The court suggested that the parliament should take steps to pass legislation that addresses these issues in a way that also respects public health and constitutional rights. So to sum it all up, the Kathumba case gave us a lot to think about. It highlighted the importance of proper procedures, especially when it comes to restricting people's rights. It also reminded us about the separation of powers, that it's a fundamental part of the constitutional democracy, and the parliament has an important role to play in overseeing the executive's actions. At the same time, the case showed us that the courts are there to protect the rights of citizens, even in times of crisis. And perhaps most importantly, it raised the issue of how measures like lockdowns can affect the most vulnerable people in a society, and the need for governments to consider this before making their decisions. So thank you for listening to my boring voice. Honestly, I was lacking. I know. I don't know why I record these episodes at night, because I am always exhausted. But thank you for listening to this episode. This is our 3rd episode. It's still a milestone. We made it. I hope this discussion has given you a better understanding of the Kathumba case and some issues that were being raised in this case. If you have any thoughts or questions, or if there's a case you'd like me to cover in the future episodes, please feel free to reach out. Until next time, take care.